Welcome, and thank you for your interest in the Federal Highway Administration's Crash Costs for Highway Safety Analysis Guide. This video presents crash cost fundamentals from the guide. After watching this video, you should be able to explain the benefits of crash costs, what they represent, and how to apply them. Understand why and how to develop and adjust national crash costs to account for state-specific factors and access related resources. You can watch the entire video from start to finish, or use the table of contents feature on the left to skip to specific sections. This section describes the benefits of using crash costs for application in highway safety analysis. The Crash Costs for Highway Safety Analysis Guide will help you learn about crash costs and how they can improve highway safety management. You can use crash costs to compare benefits and costs of highway safety improvement projects in equivalent terms. The guide also explains how to adjust crash costs and why it's important to do so. This section presents an overview of crash costs and their various components. Traffic crashes can kill road users. Others may sustain non-fatal injuries or incur property damage as a result. Crash costs capture the effects of traffic crashes on society in monetary terms. This slide shows national crash costs in terms of 2019 dollars. Crash costs are made up of items with tangible prices like medical bills, wages, and property damage, as well as intangible economic cost related to pain, suffering, and impaired quality of life. The sum of tangible components is called the economic cost. Intangible costs are based on estimated economic value of life and the amount of quality adjusted life years, or QALY, lost as a result of the crash. The total cost of all components is called the comprehensive crash cost. Because crash costs are highly dependent on severity, economists estimate crash cost values in terms of injury scales from crash reports or medical records. Most law enforcement agencies report crashes with the CABCO scale, which classifies suspected injuries using visual assessments and verbal complaints of pain. Medical professionals use the MAIS scale or MAIS scale to classify severity by a medical diagnosis of expected lethality. Each crash may involve multiple road users, and each of them may sustain multiple injuries. The term person injury cost represents the average amount of attributable to each victim. Person injury cost values are categorized by the most severe injury a person sustains, including no injuries. The overall severity of a crash is determined by the most severe injury sustained by any victim. Crash costs represent the average cost of all injuries and property damage in each crash. As an example, this crash involves 2 vehicles, 3 people, and 3 injuries, including 1 A-level person injury, 1 B-level person injury, and 1 C-level person injury. As such, the overall severity is defined as an A-level crash. The guide uses the term crash costs generally for any costs related to crash impacts. The term unit cost indicates a specific type of cost or its numerical value for analysis. This section describes 2 different ways to use crash costs. You can estimate the total economic burden of crashes over time by multiplying the number of crashes or person injuries that occurred by their average unit costs. According to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA, about 37,800 people were killed and 210,000 seriously injured on our nation's roads in 2016. You can estimate the total economic impact of those injuries by multiplying the number of each severity by the average person injury costs. If you apply 2016 costs of $10 million per fatal injury and $500,000 per serious injury, you would estimate a total economic burden of $483 billion. You can also use crash costs to estimate the cost effectiveness of strategies that increase or decrease how many injuries will occur in the future. First, you can estimate the change in crashes or injuries as some percentage increase or decrease from the number expected in an average year under average conditions. Crash costs then help you compare the benefits or disbenefits of that change in safety to the cost of changing it. You can use this approach to calculate the return on investment for a given highway safety improvement project or design alternative. Please refer to FHWA's Highway Safety Benefit Cost Analysis Guide and tool in the resources section of this video for more information. This section describes how the national crash costs listed in the Crash Costs for Highway Safety Analysis Guide were developed. In a 2010 report by NHTSA that was revised in 2015, researchers estimated values of all individual crash cost components and developed person injury and per vehicle costs in terms of Mays severity levels. The objective was to estimate the total economic impact of crashes across the United States. Economists usually estimate crash costs in the Mays injury scale because the type and nature of injury is more reliable than CABCO. However, most highway safety practitioners don't have access to medical records, and medical records are kept for each individual person, not each crash. As such, safety analysts typically conduct highway safety benefit cost analysis in terms of crashes classified by CABCO severity level. CABCO-based crash data is generally available from law enforcement reports. To facilitate CABCO crash-based analyses, FHWA translated NHTSA's cost estimates from the Mays to the CABCO scale, from units of person injuries to crashes, and from $2010 to $2016. The next series of slides explain this process. The Crash Costs Guide outlines 5 steps to develop CABCO crash costs for a state from the Mays person injury costs in NHTSA's 2010 report. The process includes translating person injury costs from Mays to CABCO scale, calculating injury to crash and vehicle to crash ratios, using those ratios to convert person injury costs to crash costs, updating those costs to current dollars, and adjusting to a state. If you already have crash cost values, such as national cost as a starting point, you can start at step 4 or step 5 as appropriate. The complementary Crash Costs Spreadsheet tool will help you adjust FHWA's national crash costs to your state or update them in future years. The following slides explain each step. You can access the Crash Costs for Highway Safety Analysis Guide and Spreadsheet tool from the Resources section at the end of this video for further details. While most crashes aren't assigned both CABCO and Mays classifications, some national research databases report both injury scales. Additionally, some states use probabilistic linkages between crash and medical records to better understand actual injury outcomes. These data form the basis for calculating factors to translate between the 2 scales. There are 2 translations of particular interest for the purpose of developing crash costs. One allows you to estimate the equivalent expected Mays person injuries from a given number of CABCO person injuries. The other allows you to translate person injury costs from the Mays to CABCO scale. You can use this table for both translations. Reading across, each row contains proportions that represent the average likelihood of each Mays outcome for a given CABCO injury. For example, one A-level injury in CABCO has about a 1.8% chance of being a Mays 5, a 4% chance of being Mays 4, 14.4% chance for being Mays 3, and so on. With this approach, you would multiply the number of CABCO scales by the Mays proportions to estimate the equivalent number of Mays injuries that likely resulted. You can also use the translation factors in reverse to develop weighted average CABCO person injury costs. To do so, you would multiply each translation factor in a row by the same Mays cost and sum the products to obtain the equivalent CABCO cost. Note that the apparent distributions shown in the columns of these translator tables are not relevant. To determine injury to crash ratios, you would calculate the number of person injuries by severity that result from an average crash of a given severity level using merged crash level and injury level records. You can calculate similar ratios for the number of vehicles in property damage only crashes. For example, based on the sample data in this table, there were 4,901 K-level person injuries in 4,502 K-level crashes. which results in a K-level injury to crash ratio of 1.09. Data spanning multiple years offer more reliable results. You can calculate injury to crash and vehicle to crash ratios using a database of crashes, vehicle level records, and injury or person level records. This table represents injury to crash ratios based on national data from 2011 to 2015, but you could develop a similar conversion table based on your state's data. As shown in this hypothetical example, one K-level crash results in an average of 1.09 fatalities, 0.3 A-level injuries, 0.29 B injuries, and so forth. To convert either person injury costs or vehicle costs to crash costs, you can use average ratios of injuries per crash or vehicles per crash by severity. This example shows how to use injury to crash ratios to determine the cost of an average fatal crash. First, multiply each Cabco person injury cost by the corresponding injury to crash ratio. The resulting values represent the average cost of injuries by severity from one crash. Sum the products to determine the equivalent fatal crash cost. Since there are no injuries in a property damage only or PDO crash, it is not appropriate to use injury to crash ratios. Instead, simply multiply the PDO cost per vehicle by the vehicle to crash ratio without rounding. In 2010, the average PDO cost per vehicle was $6,076. Based on national data from 2011 to 2015, the vehicle to crash ratio for PDO crashes was 1.78033. The resulting cost per PDO crash in 2010 dollars was $10,817. The time value of money also plays a role in crash costs and benefit cost analysis. It may not be appropriate to apply crash costs estimated in the year 2010 to crashes occurring several years later. Comparing older crash costs to current dollar project costs may misrepresent the expected value of safety benefits. This table shows an example of national average crash costs for 2010 and 2016 based on the guide. We will demonstrate how to update to 2019 values later in this video. When applying crash costs, you should consider what year those crash costs represent. You can use the crash costs spreadsheet tool to update them to future years, or revert to prior years, as needed for analysis. States should consider regularly updating standard crash costs at least every few years to keep them relevant for users. The economic cost components representing tangible goods and services should be updated using the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, which reflects the average change in prices of household goods and services over time. Specifically, the guide recommends using the unadjusted average annual current dollar CPI for all urban consumers and all items. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes CPI data. Click this link to access the Bureau of Labor Statistics CPI data. Find the link to the latest historical CPI-U data and click the link. You will get a table of unadjusted CPI values for all urban consumers by month and year. Take the average of the monthly values to get the annual average for the year of interest, such as 2019. The intangible components of crash costs associated with lost quality of life should be updated based on changes in median usual weekly earnings, or MUWE. Specifically, we recommend using the unadjusted average annual current dollar MUWE for all wage and salary workers age 16 and older. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes MUWE data. Click this link to access the Bureau of Labor Statistics MUWE data. Scroll down and click the link to Show Table. You will get a table of seasonally adjusted MUWE values for full-time wage and salary workers by sex. These values represent quarterly averages. Take the average of the quarterly values to get the annual average for the year of interest, such as 2019. You'll need the CPI and MUWE from the same year as the source crash costs, as well as the update year. For example, To update 2010 crash costs to 2019 dollars, you should determine the ratio of the CPI value in 2019 to the CPI value in 2010, and the same for MUWE. The average CPI for 2019 is 255.657, and the average CPI for 2010 is 218.056, which yields a CPI ratio of 1.17244. The average MUWE for 2019 is 917, and the average MUWE for 2010 is 746.5, which yields an MUWE ratio of 1.22840. Once you've computed the ratios, multiply each economic crash cost by the CPI ratio, and each quality of life cost by the MUWE ratio, to determine the updated costs in the target year, which in this case is 2019. Note the 2010 economic crash costs and 2010 QALY crash costs shown here differ from earlier in the video. These values reflect updated injury to crash ratios based on national data from the Crash Report Sampling System, or CRIS, for 2016 to 2018. While national crash costs are a good starting point, we suggest adjusting national crash costs to reflect local conditions in benefit cost analysis. Many components differ between states due to higher or lower prices for wages and goods. These differences are largely captured by the average per capita income, or PCI, in a state or region for a given year. You can multiply crash costs by the ratio of a state's PCI to the national PCI to make the adjustment. This table shows 2019 PCI values and 2019 PCI ratios for a few states. Each ratio is equal to the 2019 state PCI divided by the 2019 national average. The U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis reports average PCI data for each state. Click this web link to access PCI data. Scroll down and click Interactive Tables. Under Annual Personal Income and Employment by State, click on this category that represents per capita personal income. Select SAINC1 and click Next Step. Select all areas, select per capita personal income dollars, and then click Next Step. Finally, select the year or years of interest and click Next Step. The result is a table of PCI values based on the previous selections. This example illustrates the crash cost adjustment process for a hypothetical state with a PCI of $69,740 in 2019. The national average PCI was $56,490 in the same year. The PCI ratio for 2019 is the state PCI divided by the national average PCI, yielding a PCI ratio of 1.23456. This table shows the 2019 national comprehensive crash costs. You would multiply each national cost by that ratio to make the adjustment. This method is applicable to all crash costs and their components. With that, we've now completed the video on the fundamental of crash costs and methods to develop, update, and adjust them. A complementary video walks through each module of the Crash Cost Spreadsheet tool. You can use the Crash Cost Spreadsheet tool to implement any or all steps from the 5-step process. There are many resources available to support you in using crash costs and conducting highway safety benefit cost analysis. Click the web links shown on the slide to access each resource. The first resource is the FHWA Crash Costs for Highway Safety Analysis Guide. The guide has much more information about crash costs and the calculations implemented in the spreadsheet tool. The second resource is a link to the Crash Cost Spreadsheet tool. For details about the original 2010 person injury cost estimates from NHTSA, refer to NHTSA's report linked here. These costs were the basis for the 2016 CABCO National Crash Cost Estimates in the guide. FHWA's Highway Safety Benefit Cost Analysis Guide describes detailed methods to apply crash costs in benefit cost analysis. A related tool helps to implement the methods from the guide. Thank you for your interest in the Crash Costs for Highway Safety Analysis Guide. We hope you've gained a better understanding of crash costs, how they are developed, and how to update them and adjust them for highway safety economic analysis.